Thank you, everyone, for being here on the day 2 of VIP Days of Art Basel 2023, where, of course, we are all full of joy and energy that Art Basel is back, Hong Kong's back, friends are back. You know, it's just been an incredible start to the Art Week, and I trust that many of you perhaps were at M Plus on Monday, which was our official international coming out day. So we at M Plus are absolutely thrilled and energized with all the community in Hong Kong coming together, joined by international colleagues. So thank you, Stephanie Bailey and the Art Basel Hong Kong Conversations team for putting this panel together, for inviting me with the honor of moderating. Very interesting topic, provocatively titled Patronage as Practice, Developing Synergies Between Private and Public Institutions. So what we have here, the people here represent all really like visionary initiators, and we represent different types of institutions in different localities, in different parts of Asia, of course, but also across the Pacific. So, I mean, just by way of starting, maybe I will say a little bit about M+, because I was just before I came here, a group of about 10 Korean journalists asking the question that I have been asked millions of times over the last 10 years, so which is that, what is your relationship with the Hong Kong government? Because people still think that M+ is governmental, and some of you in the audience may think that we are a government museum. But M+ is part of West Kowloon Cultural District Authority, which is a public body established by the government, but with one-time investment and ordinance established, it is an independent statutory body responsible for developing a whole new cultural district, which has now taken shape. So speaking of patronage, our origin wouldn't be possible without the state patronage. But of course, because we are not a state institution, we're not a government institution, we have the big piece of work we have been doing is to develop what the future patronage looks like. So starting a patrons program, membership, but also cultivating sponsorships and corporate partners over the years, even before the museum opened. So that's just one example of how patronage is absolutely integral and indispensable for any institution around the world, but it can take many different forms. So I think we have a rare opportunity to hear about 3 different institutions and how that practice, patronage as practice, works there. So I would like to kick off. I mean, I want this to be really a conversation. So I'm just going to pretend that I'm a moderator for the first 15 minutes or so, and then I think hopefully it will be an open conversation amongst us. So I would first like to turn to Nadia and Rajeeb to ask the following questions. So what were the motivations for and impulses behind starting the Dhaka Art Summit? And I believe you have just completed your 6th edition, yes. And what are the most valuable accomplishments and learnings over the years?
Thank you. So Rajeeb and I started off as collectors, and over the years where we traveled to different institutions, biennales, and museums, we saw that the presence of Bangladesh was hardly there. And people were really curious about Bangladesh and Bangladeshi art scene. And we always thought that there is a Bangladeshi art scene, but how come people don't know about it? And how do people not have access to it? So that's how the idea of the foundation came, and Dhaka Art Summit came, that we wanted to create a platform where the whole world would come to Bangladesh and see our art, meet our artists, and where we could work as a bridge to connect the international art world to Bangladesh. And yes, so over the years, this works as a festival. It's a biennial event, but it's not a biennale. It's our own model that we've created. We work with different curators, several curators actually, under one roof. And it's like a pop-up museum. It's like a festival. We have talks, we have performance, we have workshops, we have many things under one roof. And over the years, it's become a huge public platform. And and we just finished our 6th edition.
So just to add with Nadia that the whole thing started when we started collecting about 16 years back together. And we thought that, we wanted to collect artists from our generation. So this the time we started going to different Bangladeshi artist studio and looking at their work. And then we realized that there are so many talented artists, but rest of the world has no clue. So what we did, initially we started supporting some of the projects of those artists in different places, outside Bangladesh, with residency and others. Then we realized that this is how it's not going to work. Probably it is going to take us 200 years to do something. So we will have to do something that will bring the world to Bangladesh. That's how the Dhaka Art Summit idea just came. And initially, actually, we didn't know what we were doing. So we were like, okay, we'll just do an event like this and let's see what happens. So what we did, as Nadia mentioned, that, our main idea is that we will do an event and we will work with different curators from different institutions whose research we can support in South Asia. And when they go back, they will take back the knowledge with them. So there will be a continuation. So that is how it started, and I think we have come a long way. And now we are also doing collaboration within South Asia. Like our last edition, we did a show with Kiran Nadar Museum. Roobina is here, so so we did a collaboration where the exhibition we showed it in Dhaka, and then this exhibition is also going to travel to India, Delhi. So though we are nearby, but we didn't have this kind of major private collaboration also. So I think in our 12, 13 years journey, we have come a long way. And one thing, we feel now proud that our art won't be ignored anymore, because, when we would go before, people would talk about South Asia, there was a confusion about the definition of South Asian art. People rarely knew about us. But today, actually, with a lot of excitement, when we see that, our artists are everywhere, even in the collection of museums, on display, even at the Art Basel, one of our artists, he's in the solo booth of Javeri Contemporary. So that's how Dhaka Art Summit has started. And now with Dhaka Art Summit, we are also setting up our permanent space that is northeastern part of Bangladesh. Nadia, would you like to talk about it?
So yes, it's in the northeastern part of Bangladesh, Sylhet, and it's called Srihatta Samdani Art Center and Sculpture Park, where it will be a sculpture park, residency space, and an art center. So it will also have its own programs, especially the residency program. The sculpture park will take years, of course, because we're in the process of commissioning artists to do projects there. And the art center will be housing some of our collections that Rajeeb and I have collected over the years. And we have collected some institutional size pieces of works. And when we saw those works actually last couple of years ago, we loved it so much. That's before the sculpture park idea came. We love these works so much, and that's how we acquired them without thinking what's going to happen, where they will go. And I think eventually, over some time, we thought that these works need a home. And so the art center will house these works.
Yes, great. So, you were already referring to the collaboration between Dhaka Art Summit and Kiran Nadar Museum of Art, so that's a perfect segue to turn to Roobina. Could you please share with us the origin and the history of Kiran Nadar Museum? How did it begin? With what mission? How has it evolved over the years? I know that's a big question. There's a lot to talk about, so yeah.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. I want to thank quickly the organizers of Art Basel. I want to thank Dorian, my colleagues here, Shan there, Apurva. Thank you very much for inviting me. I can answer this question because I have been with the Kiran Nadar Museum since its inception. We are in the 13th year, and I feel that we continue to self-define and self-reflect on ourselves. And I think that is a continuous exercise that happens as far as museums are concerned. I think it started with Kiran Nadar, who is an avid art collector. She felt that she needed to share what she was collecting with an audience, and bring it out. The sharing was important. And the second part was that though India is developing very fast, we do see signs of very accelerated development in terms of economic projects, flyovers, many other spaces coming in, consumer boom, many other things. Sadly, the dearth for cultural art and cultural spaces continues to be there. And I think that was the trigger for her, that we need to do something for art and culture. We need to bring visibility to what is happening right now, what our art is grappling, what kinds of practices are happening at the moment. And though India, with such a long civilizational history, has thousands of museums, I can't tell you, in the remotest corners you would find museums, but they're more emphasized and more focused on antiquarian interest. And so here was a museum that was being dedicated to modern and contemporary art, and I think very few museums exist in India, even today, that are really catering to looking at and addressing modern and contemporary art practices. So this is what triggered this. Of course, it wasn't easy. I think any private museum setting up itself is seen always as counter to national museums or museums which are government funded and already there. So initial skepticism always comes in as to how will a private museum proceed. But I think as we went along, we were able to understand that there is a lot of work to do. You have to cultivate audiences, you have to grow your collection, and you also have to find a way to make this collection more experiential, more accessible to audiences. And therefore, the mandate is not just or the mission was not just to have a space to really present the collection, or to make this a repository of art objects, but to really make it a place which is like a place of confluence and convergence and conversations around what you're presenting. And I think that kind of a mission is what we were working on, and we are still working on. And it has taken us really these many years to really populate the museum, if I have to say that. It takes time. Initial years were difficult, but one has to work on what will be those strategies that will really bring audiences, knowing well that audiences are not a monolith. There are a variety of publics and variety of audiences, and therefore how you diversify your programs and how you really bring exhibitions, to make exhibitions a mediating tool between the audience and the art. So this is where we are. Yeah.
That's beautifully said, Roobina. Just to push a little bit there, so I'm imagining a kind of a triangular relationship between the patron, the collector's private passions originally and vision, and curatorial ambitions and imperatives, and then public reception, and you were also talking about audience expectations. So how do you balance these three different points of the triangle, and is there a certain circular or cyclical relationship between these three parts? Do they inform and change one another?
A good question. I think the triangle can only happen when there are three angles, and so it is that they are in a relationship that could, I would say, a symbiotic relationship in some way. It is a give and take. It's something works, something doesn't work. Some things we learn from audiences. Some things we teach the audiences or we bring to the audiences. And it is a relationship of that kind. And I think why I emphasized audiences is because I think if we really survey India, then India has national museums with incredible collections, unbelievable, from Mohenjo-daro, from prehistoric times to now. But the realization is that museums are not successful only because of great collections, not just because of a great architectural building. These two are very good bonus points. But if we are able to draw museums, people into the museums, then we are able to say that, yes, we have made a connect with the people around. I think it's very easy to say museum for all. This is a very easy term. It's a very easy sentence to drop, and say that, yes, we want a museum for all, but what does it mean? What are the ways to do this? Because it's not so easy and not so simple. I remember when I did the survey, when I joined Kiran, my first presentation to her was to build a museum without a front door. I think just crossing the threshold for publics, is something that one has to start thinking of right from there. How do you get them in? Only after that you can do whatever you can do to really get them hooked on. And I think the difference between biennales, summits, and many other kinds of forms and formats which are extremely important is that museums need to have a sustainable audience. Not an audience for 3 days, not an audience for 3 months. You have to have an audience that keeps coming back. And that challenge is really huge. What do you do to bring audiences back again and again? If you run an exhibition for 6 months, will they come back? How many will come back? So the strategies are all revolving around understanding audiences, the nature of audiences that come to the museum, and not just the demographic study or survey. That doesn't help really. It has to be deeper engagement. You have to find different and new ways to test the waters. So I think the question that you're asking is very valid. One cannot be without the other when you think how you want to grow the museum and how do you want to nurture it in the future.
Right. Thank you very much, Roobina. So now I turn to you, Michael. So you're sitting here with new kids on the block. We've been only open for a year and a half. And as both Nadia and Rajeeb and Roobina said, they have been doing it for somewhere between 10 to 15 years. Now, LACMA has been around for much longer. So as the oldest and most established institution among this group, could you briefly describe the origin and history of the museum first? And what is the relation? Well, let's do that first before we go to the next question.
Thank you, Duran, and congratulations, M+, amazing for the whole world. And speaking of origins, I think I was asked to come be a consultant to conversations on M+ 30 years ago when I worked for the Guggenheim. So it's been a long time in gestation, as you know, and finally it's come to fruition. And it's an amazing thing for the whole world to have this big museum from an Asian point of view, and connecting with all of us. So it's just an exciting thing. And it's funny, so it's so nice to be the old museum here because in the United States, among big city museums, think about the Metropolitan Museum in New York and Chicago, they're all 150 years old. And we're 50 years old, we're about my age, and which we consider very new in the sense that we were born into a very contemporary era, really in the 60s. And so we have this completely different perspective on being a museum of everything. So we have art of antiquity, but from the moment of the inception of the museum, artists were present. So with all of those. And so that's kind of shaped our character, that while we're the biggest museum in the Western United States and we have 70,000 objects, that we have this kind of a new spirit, I hope, that we've tried to sort of exploit recently, as it's been more important to, I think, for museums to always be thinking freshly. And we're always learning. I mean, I'm always looking closely at the innovation of all small museums and private museums, because there are always the sparks of innovation when you're starting fresh and you're thinking, well, why don't we do it differently? So I think the ecosystem is what's really interesting. And also, I mean, I guess California, between India and California, it's greater Asia, right, around the Pacific. We're all part of some new world.
You were referring to other big city museums in the US, and I think LACMA is, yes, younger than them, but if I'm not mistaken, it's also a little bit unique compared to other museums in the sense that it's a bit of a hybrid model, because it is called LA County Museum.
Yeah, the public. So we were founded in a hybrid model where the County of Los Angeles, meaning the public and the taxpayers, contribute. It was most of the money at that time, but now it's about 20% of the operating budget and about 20% of the money for our new building. So it's a public-private partnership, but most of the funding comes now 80% from private individuals. And a lot of them are art collectors and patrons themselves. So it's a really interesting model. I like the public investment. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, museums should just be paid for by private money and not tax money in the US, but I think it's so exciting to have the public to be invested in the place, and it also makes us act differently when we have to answer to those investors, if you will, that, you know, if you're constantly raising money and you have public money, I always say you have to listen. Like, you can't be your own, you know, closed-in entity because you have all these stakeholders and you have to listen, which is kind of a good way to remain open.
So some of the key stakeholders, because of course you're sitting here in Hong Kong, I have to ask those stakeholders who are based in Asia. Of course, a couple of the major projects that you initiated for LACMA is the partnership with Hughes Foundation and the museum, as well as the partnership with Hyundai. Could you speak about how they came about and what roles they play in the overall planning for the institution?
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason 17 years ago I moved to Los Angeles to take on this rebuilding of a big civic museum was because of the diversity of the public of Los Angeles. It's probably the most diverse city on earth. And the creative aspect of it, there are so many artists there. But also, as I always say in my stump speech, used to be, you know, the view from the Pacific, which is kind of I mean, maybe obvious here, but when you think about art museums in Europe and the East Coast, which fully dominate the conversation still about exhibitions and modern art and all of that, it's a totally different perspective. And so part of that mission from very start was to, like, turn your shoulders the other way. Instead of looking from New York or looking back across the Atlantic it's like we definitely look at Paris, but we look at it through Hong Kong. and so that idea meant partnerships. And so we I've committed a huge amount of time to trying to build bridges and partnerships across the Pacific. So they resulted in many kinds. One was this partnership with the Hughes Museum. You and I were on a panel when Booty Tech was still alive, right here, I think, talking about this partnership of a private museum in Shanghai, where Booty had, by that time, he had cancer. Great patron of the arts, somebody who really excited people about contemporary art, like the stories I'm hearing. And he was feeling his mortality and reached out in our conversations to, well, what if LACMA could help? And so we forged a partnership where we were going to, you know, be half the equation. And then we actually brought Hyundai, our partners in Korea, because I think we're the largest museum programming entity back and forth between the US and Korea, US and Mexico, and we were working on, you know, could we do that also with China? And so that was part of that initiative to just know that the world is interconnected deeply, and the more cross investments we had, the closer we would be. And so that was the dream. We opened our first show. There's a picture of Booty when he was still alive, when we were opening the exhibition of our collection with an emphasis on Hollywood and Los Angeles and tropes of making art around movies. And then the pandemic shut us down. And of course, everything's changed since then. So I'm literally here with our team trying to rethink how we will work with M+ and work with so many other museums. But it was this dream that we would build this active bridge where we'd just be running a museum with them there and pulling partners together. Qatar Museums was also part of the partnership, and so we had the Middle East connecting, and exhibitions were coming from them, and so there was this dream of a global connected world, I think, that we were aiming for and still are somehow, even though it will take many years.
So you already started the whole museum to museum, institution to institution collaboration, and it was already mentioned that there was collaboration that has already happened, will continue between Dhaka Art Summit and the Kiran Nadar.
We'll have to work LACMA into that somehow soon.
Yes. Yeah, if you can speak a bit about what that is, how that came about, and how it has unfolded and will unfold, that would be great.
As I mentioned earlier, and for Dhaka Art Summit, it's a model that we created, and in Bangladesh, we don't have any contemporary art museum or museum that is dedicated to art. So Dhaka Art Summit works as a pop-up museum for contemporary art, and it's like a festival. So since it's our own model, we designed the exhibition in our own way, which we think would be suitable for the public, and because it's a big public event. And so every edition we invite curators from different institutions to work with us. And this time we partnered with the Kiran Nadar Museum, and so their curator Akansha and our artistic director Diana, they collaborated on this exhibition called A Very Small Feelings. And it was a beautiful exhibition with, I can't remember exactly how many artists, but it was focused on, targeted to younger audience, and also bringing out your inner child. And it was very playful. And because Dhaka Art Summit is a public event, and we really focus on exhibitions that the public would enjoy and how people can engage and make meaningful conversations. So it was very well received, and this exhibition, and actually this was the first time we partnered with a South Asian institutions, and you know, it's important for South Asian institutions to collaborate and do things together. So I think this was a first step.
There was tremendous learning, I think, in that whole process, because I think we are all focused on South Asia, and we know that South Asia is really emerging as a very important center, an important region, and really looking into that is important. And I don't think it was restricted to just artists from this region, but just the idea that one could actually look at parallel histories or parallel kind of practices, which is also what has happened in the exhibition that I recently co-curated with Iftikhar Dadi, which first opened. It was a collaboration between Sharjah Art Foundation and Kiran Nadar Museum of Art, and it really was looking at addressing the notion of pop in South Asia, you know. So how do we explore popular practices within this region, and also tracing the trajectory or the trope right from early historical period to now, and arriving at an understanding that everything has not come from the West. Of course, the West was an influence. We all grew up with that pop art practices there. But how things get localized and what other kinds of influences become extremely important, like the vernacular traditions or the folk pocket traditions, the folk traditions, or cinema. So to say, India, Bollywood is such a huge cinema, such a huge industry. Or the print culture that goes back to Raja Ravi Verma, which is like in the late 19th century. So there were many of these things that the survey helped us to do and bring forth. And it first was shown in Sharjah, now it is on in Delhi. But these collaborations, I think, can be of different kinds. You know, they could be conceptual, they could be lending and exchanging of works, there could be intellectual kind of exchange. and also a collaboration as we are doing right now with Samdani's, which is the work first opens there, the audiences there get to see it, and then it travels to our venue or our destination, and then it is here for 3 months more. And so what are the learnings can also be a whole book in itself, a whole publication in itself, as to how these kinds of programs or projects can really bring change.
These are really inspiring examples across Asia. The collaborations between Dhaka and New Delhi, and of course, Sharjah is another key institutions in the region that has together really sort of shifted the perspective. Really, instead of always the discourse turning into what is the origin, what are the derivations, what are the different points of origin, what are different points of adaptations as well. Now, we certainly want to be part of that discourse as well. But having said that, of course, we in the art world, in the museum world, I think we always start our work founded on spirit of collegiality, even if our countries and our states may not necessarily be friends all the time. But having said that, even between Bangladesh and India and the UAE and Hong Kong and China, we all have different legal structure, different kinds of points of pressure. So can we share with the audience some, not just the rosy utopian picture, but some of the challenges that have come up, and I will include you, Michael, as well, about between the collaboration between the American institution working with the Chinese institution with its own peculiarities and rigidity and all of that. So if we could talk a little bit about that.
I just want to quickly add to this that the co-curator, who was also initial, who is actually responsible, who started the research, Professor Iftikhar Dadi, who's also an artist, could not come to India, could not get visa. And so despite the challenges, the idea is that we want to overcome these limitations and these political constraints and limitations by not shunning the project or dismissing that it's not possible, but to go ahead, despite some artists not making it, despite the co-curator not making it. And that was the effort and attempt that, so yes, there are these, everything is not rosy, of course, and the pictures are rarely rosy. In fact, I believe even an artist from Bangladesh could not easily get a visa. So these are realities, with which we work, and the other big reality is censorship with the new regime. So I remember doing an exhibition many years ago, and I don't think I can ever do it again in India. I can never again show those works in India. So we work with these political exigencies and change of ideologies and governments.
Yeah, it's interesting that what's happened in the last 2 decades, and here it is the expansion of private initiatives in this art world. So we have I think the worlds of museums have been generally professionally collegial, but the majority of museums globally were in a governmental structure, right? And so it was always delicate and tentative when, there were kinds of exchanges. But one of the exciting things, and here we're seeing it, and we're seeing it around the world with private initiatives, is that there's just much more mobility, flexibility. And so even though we're a hybrid, we use the private side of LACMA to support my initiatives to make sure that I don't have to check with the government when we're pushing and investing in work in China and every place else. Obviously, we're all dealing with challenges, and exhibitions we do at the Hughes Museum have a different review structure than they do at LACMA, which came up very strongly in our board and our curatorial content is like, how can you... But then I think about, well, we have so much to show. We're just beginning this collaboration. Even if you leave out things that are not possible in both places, there's a lot that is possible in both places. So you can start with something where we can work together and show things and get that going. But I think it's really exciting because I think we're building all of these networks. again, we all have our government structures, but then there's people and artists and art that connect us all. And I think we're entering a new world in that sense, because the globe is getting connected that way. I mean, M+ is an example of a hybrid model, right? Like where you have government investment, private initiative, and enough private support that you have a lot of flexibility.
Can I quickly add, Dorian? I have a good successful story to say about the Venice Biennale, which was a collaboration with the government, Ministry of Culture, the National Gallery of Modern Art, the CII, the Confederation of Industries, and KNMA. So since there has been no Indian pavilion, at Venice for the last many, many years, 8-9 years, we have only participated twice. So Mrs. Nadar really pushed the government and went on telling them that an Indian pavilion is important, at the Venice Biennale. And that's how this collaboration began. Now, the Venice Biennale Foundation organization does not give the pavilion to any private institution. It has to be it's a national pavilion. And so the government has to pay for it or rent it. Okay, so the government comes in. So so we worked out a method to work together. And I must say that I want to emphasize the word negotiations of different kinds. But I want to say that it at the end really worked, that the government did certain things that they needed to do. And all the curatorial and conceptual aspect, the museum took care of, KNMA took care of. And that's how we really made it. And it really worked very well. It was rated as one of the first 5 pavilions, the must-see pavilions, But a lot of negotiations and a lot of understanding goes into this, because I think sometimes private and public collaborations, they have to work out the compatibility. It may not be there, but I think the negotiations lead to that. And a lot of things, for instance, the government told us you cannot show anything. You will show only works that are related to Mahatma Gandhi, because it is Gandhiji's 100th anniversary. So can you imagine a theme like that in a contemporary Biennale? So can you imagine what the curator will go through? I mean, I didn't know what to do. I was totally dumbstruck, and I said, how do we do this? I told Kiran, let's not do it, perhaps. And she said, no, that's not the approach. We must do something. So, of course, I worked out very provocative and subversive works, but my stories to the government, sorry, is this recorded? But the stories to the government were very different. I told them this is very important. This is India's self-reflection. This is Gandhi. He was relevant in his time, but he's relevant now. Okay? So see what Atul Dodia does with Gandhi. He's talking about Gandhi as a figure of non-violence and the violence that is percolating in the cities of India. I had to really do this. I don't know how many times I was called to the government place to give this understanding that we are not doing something that the government does not agree to.
And there is no golden age when that didn't happen. Like, honestly, the whole history of humanity and art history is all a negotiation in whatever context of power structures, and artists and others have always navigated and negotiated. The constraints have created creativity. So it's hard to say that there was like some golden age when that didn't happen. And so I think we know that, right? That's...
Just to add, actually, I think our situation is a bit different, because when we started Dhaka Art Summit, we have been doing this from day one with the government. And, the understanding was very clear that no interference with the curatorial process or selection of the artist. So I think this is something we have worked it out from the very beginning. And censorship also wise, we never had any issues, because even Bangladeshi modernists also, they use a lot of nudities in their work also in the past. So our audience is sort of used to, but I think our challenge was somewhere else. So when we started Dhaka Art Summit, of course, everyone thinks that, okay, a lot of excitement, Bangladesh, everyone must be super excited that an event like this is happening. But from the very beginning, we were going against the wind, because the art world was against us, the Bangladeshi art world, and that is because that there was an established market, And the artists we were working with, all these emerging contemporary artists, no one would ever acknowledge their work, or, photography, that is not even an work. He's a journalist or she's a journalist. So, when we started showing these artists, there were a lot of resistance from the art community. So that is what, after probably 12, 13 years to an extent, we have managed, and we are still managing. But so I think there are challenges. Whichever way you look at it, there are challenges. And just going back to the previous topic, I think one thing that is very important, and we are so happy to collaborate with Kiran Nadar Museum, because I think we were all trying to go to the West. So I think this is the time we should do collaboration among ourselves. So that is actually one of the example, and this is the largest private sector, actually, two private institutions collaborating together. So that is also we are very happy.
And a need to write one's own histories. Very important.
Absolutely. And the other thing I wanted to add with challenges, as Bangladesh, we're a new country. We're just 51 years old. And when it comes to contemporary art, we don't have any dedicated museum. So when we started doing the Dhaka Art Summit, we realized that, okay, we have the artists, we're using the government building or the government facilities, but where are the installers? Where are the lighting consultants? So I think we really have challenges with logistical things, like, some things where in the West or in the other parts, you kind of take it for granted. And for us, it's really quite a challenge. So I think over the years, actually in the last 10 years, we've managed to train a group of young people like art handlers, art mediators, and volunteers basically who work with us.
Building infrastructure for the future, really. So I think the one common description that we can have about all these four very different, four very different cities and localities and contexts, is that we are all committed to our locality, but then there is a certain pivoting that has happened. I was just thinking when, Michael, you were saying that when you came to Los Angeles to run LACMA, then you really wanted to turn towards the Pacific, just like Obama's pivot to Asia. But then we are also talking about writing our own histories, and that also requires really changing intellectual vectors, and then changing different partners, and then also thinking about different models of collaboration. But having said that, while we are putting down deep roots for our own localities, we also do others, and I'm specifically looking at you, Nadia and Rajeeb, because you're also patrons of other institutions outside of Bangladesh, including those that are well established in the West. So what is the meaning for you to maintain the patronage as practice for your own locality, but also maintaining the presence and foothold in other cities and other institutions?
See, I co-chair the South Asia Committee for Tate, and when actually I was approached by Tate in 2012, I think, we were super excited to be a part of this committee, because they were the first Western institution who looked at South Asian art so seriously. And I think that was also a huge movement, because now, and of course, all these institutions, also they have followings. And then, other than these museums, we work with several closely. We are involved with Delphina Foundation. We are part of their international council, which is an amazing institutions in UK, and they have their residency. So I think that collaboration and support, these are the things too important. So one way, you have the institutions, because we want those institutions to collect our art. So when they collect, the other institutions also see, and it's a different journey. And on the other hand, you have organizations like Delphina Foundations and others, where actually they're also educating our artists, opening doors for our artists. So I think this is for us. These are equally important. While we have our organization, we also need our friends. So, yeah, Nadia?
Yeah, I think of course, institutions are, they set trends, and there's huge followings. And I think it's also knowledge gaining for us to learn from these institutions. When you're part of these committees, of course, we say it's like a school. You learn and you kind of get the first-hand research from the curators. And for us, it's important because, we run a foundation for us to get that educational insight. And also these collaborations are very important.
So, Michael, LACMA is one of the great encyclopedic institutions in the US and in the West. I think big part of what you have been doing over the last few years, and we're all, of course, waiting for the opening of the Peter Zumthor building soon, is to really break down the categorizations and different boxes, which were historically, architecturally at LACMA expressed as boxes, different separate cubby holes. So they were divided into different periods, different countries, different cultures, but I'm sure you're managing many different patrons and stakeholders who are dedicated to those periods or countries. So as you're creating much more flat and porous structure in the new building where these things are not divided, then I imagine that it comes with a lot of management of expectations on different interest groups.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, the whole idea of these museums we call encyclopedic, and we think of them as a thing of the West. I guess partly I'm trying to be less Western, but less anything. I love the chaotic diversity of Los Angeles because you're not sure where you are. I have friends in Mexico City or friends even here in Asia, and there's parts of LA, and their kids get confused where they are. And I think that's a cool thing. Like there are places that have deep locality, and then LA is a city of a huge amount of migration and churn. And so one of the benefits of it is that maybe it's like you don't want every museum to be the same at all. and so maybe our role is to be this more chaotic, fluid space where the Peter Zumthor building is designed to be a horizontal surface in a organic shape. Yes, our entrances are outside. My whole thing with the ticket desk is you have to be able to walk your dog to the ticket desk to make it that much more accessible. But this horizontal space with glass around it is permeable, transparent, and it has no front or no back because it has no facade. And so it tries to be as non-centered as possible. And then the program is not based on categories because honestly, all those categories in museums are essentially a 19th century model of colonialism, right? The whole point of the categories was to organize the world as it was imagined from a colonialist perspective, where the time-space grids divides up the world. And even museums kind of operate like that in colonialist practice in the way that, if you have more money and more patronage in a particular area of the museum, then you can expand it, and then you hold on to your territory. And so I think the idea is if you're going to decolonize the museum, the art space, and we're a good place to imagine that because we do have objects from everywhere, all time, place. And then the question is, there's what you have, but the question is how you show it. And if you can put it in motion, you can, we have no distinctions. Art is art, whether it's old art or new art or this art or that. And I think that's mostly how future generations and our kids, my kids, think about the world. They don't have it in such clear categories. So it's not to negate locality, because you just made this is a great example of creating a locality and access for artists to the rest of the world with a specific locality. Part of the reason that doesn't happen is when museums are oppressively dogmatic about what is and isn't art and what should be shown and what shouldn't be shown, when, of course, the world is full of art of all kinds, depending on how you frame it. And so I guess that's what our big experiment is that. And yes, I have alienated patrons who are specifically interested in one area of the museum and it's being fixed and powerful. but that's a cost to hopefully a larger access, my hope, to patronage, because I'm very practical, that is interested in this new idea of can you decolonize art history? Can you find open ways for every, you know, because you said it is easy to say it's for everyone, but I'm saying it's not just for the public, everyone, but it's for, you know, art production of every kind, and to start to, the last story about the new building, it's made of concrete, this horizontal surface, which is a solid material, and Peter Zumthor, the architect, is known for his use of light and shadow. And light and shadow, if you have windows, is always changing. So you never stick you go into the museum, hopefully you never put your toe in the same river twice. Time of day, season, and you'll feel differently. And my hope is that unconsciously that underpins this idea that history itself and categories are immutable, like light and weather and things, is that it depends on the moment and you can reframe things in a different way. So, I mean, I think every museum should be different. This is our, place. We're the last of those Western museums, if you were, or if you want, and we're trying not to be. We were part of Mexico. We're connected in the Pacific. So I think that is our gambit to be something different.
Well, I think that's a great place to now open up to the rest of the room and see if we have questions from the floor. There's one over there.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for the discussion. I have a question about the growing challenges for a technologically changing scene. And so a number of prominent art institutions have recently announced the acquisition or donation of blockchain artworks to their collections, LACMA being amongst them. So I'm wondering how much you could share about the infrastructure required for the custodianships of these kinds of works, and also how that model could possibly be shared, or what regions that are interested in blockchain works could learn from this. Thank you.
Michael, do you want to start us?
Well, yes, we did recently announce a major gift, and it was very planned in the sense that we've been collecting digital art for decades. We have an exhibition right now on view which is about art and the computer from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But again, art and technology have been married since since whatever, stone tools and, again, paint in tubes by the Impressionists of the Industrial Revolution, which allowed painting outside. Technology is always part of that. And so part of the openness of the museum is to embrace all methods and media of creative practice. And this is very evident in our present culture that it's very important to artists, and artists are driving it. I think that's the thing I always think about is follow the artists. What change, what innovation, what thinking are they driving, not just in technology? And so we're doing that, but of course the museum's in dialogue because the so-called, I don't know, everybody is collecting NFTs, but these so-called smart contracts that go with them aren't actually that smart when it comes to museums. Even in the United States, copyright law doesn't allow you to just exhibit a work of media. So we're spending ridiculous time with legal teams trying to figure out how to do the two things that museums do with art. We don't just collect art, but exhibit the art publicly and then preserve it for the future. And literally, we have books that are 500 years old, right? They're no problem. We have them. They lasted. But digital art, we don't know. So it's an open question. More of us need to be working on that because there is all this creative production. But I think that's the idea. We need to be committed to following artists, and that's where the artists are going. And so we're doing that. We have an exhibition we're creating. One of the curators is here of digital art by women, for example. Also because when we get involved in the technology, like right now, the business of technology is gendered economically, and so we're trying to push against that. So there are ways to think about it from a museum perspective that's interesting. No answers, just lots of questions and lots of effort.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you very much. I'm interested in this idea of sort of like a local art scene brought onto an international kind of scale, or international museums, or even at an art fair like this. Could you speak of some of the difficulties of sort of like, have you found that an artist that you understand in its local context, and curators and artists seem to really value in a local community. When you bring it to a sort of broader context, is it hard to transfer? And speaking as someone who just moved from the States to Hong Kong, finding out that Asian American is very much not a sort of way of framing Asian art here. I'm curious about when you take a local artist onto an international stage, what the difficulties of that might be.
It's a very important question, and I think we face this all the time. I'll start from saying I liked what Nadia said, and I think the museum at Delhi, KNM, is also working through local to international or global. So there are many concentric circles, okay, that move you from the local to the national to, how you go towards the international. I think this question was much more difficult to answer several years ago, many years ago. I think liberalization and travels, biennales coming up, many other kinds of alternate spaces and alternate kinds of events around art have allowed to create new interest groups or new aligned groups and new alternate groups where artists are also speaking to other artists across the globe. And that, in one sense, is also bringing in new kinds of discourse, which is not a discourse which is only exclusively global anymore. Okay? And I remember I curated an exhibition on Nasreen Mohammadi, who was a woman modernist born in, who died in 1990. And much later, in 2014, I curated this exhibition, which first happened in Delhi. And it had people come from all over. And there were a whole group of directors and curators who came from Spain, got very interested in what was shown here, tried to relate it with women abstractionists in the other part of the world. And then finally that exhibition traveled to Spain. From Spain, it traveled to New York and was the inaugural show at Met Breuer. And it made me think, I thought a lot about it. Because when I was presenting it in India, I was curatorially thinking about an artist who is dead, and now I want to really bring her presence back into the exhibit. Okay, and she was my teacher as well. She was also my guide. So I had very close relationship with her. And yet I was not just working through empathy or subjectivity. I was also thinking very objectively about how to do this. And in that course of time, I realized that yes, there are certain histories that across the globe people are working on. One of that history is, where are these women modernists? Agnes Martin is one we have heard, but there were some in Asia, some somewhere else, some in Brazil, and therefore a network of such women artists emerges, and they all were working in the 1960s. And it opens up the discourse further on, how modern history was written. Okay, so I think your question is extremely valid. Sometimes it works like this. Okay, other times the curator, of course, has to work on conceptually, how to make this work, which is created in a village in India or a small town in India, becomes relevant to the larger public. How will it speak? In which way? In which form? What is it that you can? Is it ecological duress? If artist is doing that, like Jayashree Chakravarti, I curated a show at Museum Guimet in Paris, and I was just figuring out what is it that I'm going to present. Okay, apart from, yes, the artist works actually with organic substances and organic material, collects nature fragments and then creates a world out of it, It's not Monet, it's a very different kind of world, okay? And to talk about this ecological duress, how do I make it more meaningful and relevant to the global audience? And sometimes it works, sometimes one has to work harder. I totally agree that it's not an easy transplantation as such. But the world is going through many similar problems, if I have to say, one of which is environment, degradation, ecology, political violence, political disturbances, territory fights and border fights, and so on.
So maybe I can add from my perspective. I think the question that was asked, I think, is almost fundamentally related to almost everything that we do at M+. One of the very important projects that we took on before the museum opened already is to organize Hong Kong Pavilion exhibition. So it also connects to what you had to do with the Indian government to bring back the National Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. Everybody calls it Hong Kong Pavilion, not just from here, but everybody who comes to it now is quite well recognized. But of course, it's not a pavilion because we're not a nation. So Hong Kong Arts Council, Arts Development Council, who is also statutory body, just like M+, is responsible for presenting Hong Kong exhibition, which is a collateral event, actually, in Venice. And we were already tasked by the Arts Development Council to select the artists and curate the exhibition, already begun in 2013. Now, this was, only 10 years ago, but there was almost a self-imposed perception in the art community, and I was also resonating with when you were saying that starting Dhaka Art Summit, one of the biggest resistance was coming from the established art community. And we had the sort of similar situation here, but then there was almost like a lot of self-doubt in its own ability in the art community here, if I can say so, that Hong Kong has a very challenging situation because it's expensive city, it's hard to find spaces, but then Hong Kong art would never be understood outside because our conditions are very, very specific. And as a museum, we were able to really turn that perception, self-perception around to say that no, our job is take that peculiarities or uniqueness and then translate it for the international audience. So I think we really have been able to do that successfully in the 5 editions that we have done. Artists like, the first one was Lee Kit, the second was Zhang Qianhua, the third was Samson Young, all of the same generation, all in the mid to late 30s when they were selected. The first 3 together really proved that there is a very strong generation of artists that came out of Hong Kong. And then we expanded that idea by the next 2 editions, inviting women artists, because we were also very conscious that the first 3 were guys, women artists of older generation, to really enrich and deepen what Hong Kong art really means. But then I was also thinking about this isn't just a recent phenomenon. All the things have changed a lot in the last 10 years or so. If you go to our galleries, then you see a lot of diasporic artists who are originally from Asia, including Asian Americans. You would see figures like Zheng Guangqi, who's from here but ended up in New York, Cai Guochang coming from mainland via Japan, ends up in the US. But this is just the last generation, but there are many other generations before that. When you think about somebody like Zhao Qi, who moves to Europe and settles in Paris by 1950. We have Rashid Arain, who's originally from Pakistan, but went to the UK. And I was just yesterday at the fair, was talking to one of the dealers about Rashid made this conceptual performative photography because everyone in the early 1970s in London were expecting that, or they were interpreting everything that he does, which is pure geometric painting, as Islamic. And then he said, no, like I am actually part of your discourse as much as I'm part of my legacy. So this question of belonging, I guess, as well as fluidity, again, of you can have more than one identity, your origin doesn't fix who you are, is really central to what we do at the museum, but I think it also applies to all of our work.
Hello, thank you, Art Basel. It's my honor to be here all the way from mainland China. And, due to the pandemic, it has been many years we haven't traveled here. And when it's open, I came here just with my friend, and I would define myself as a global citizen with a crossover discipline mindset, and I'm a newcomer to the art field and market, although I studied in Finland before, and I also visited Guggenheim Museum and more than 10 years ago. And I would like to ask a question very practically, could I? Yeah, because last year, I represent a tech art company, studio in Guangzhou, and we do a lot of interactive installations. And during last year, we made the local exhibition in Foshan, and there's a lot of challenges. You know, mainland China is so different from Hong Kong. It's so open and international. We have a lot of challenges, so there are 3 questions I want to ask. First one is about the art market. Because I'm quite new here, I used to do performing arts. But with the visual arts, it's quite, for me, it's ambiguous. That local collectors do a lot of they even can establish their own museums. But for us, we really don't know how our galleries and how this government thing work together. And first thing is for this. Second one is about the whole the funding system, and the local government with the business part. I really appreciate what Michael you said about public-private partnership, but locally there are a lot of also details to discuss. At the end of the day, who is the final decision maker? We're trying very hard to persuade probably both sides to help us to support the art, because last year we did this upcycling exhibition with a British artist in a contemporary art museum, which is just 2 years old. And of course, we need to also think about outreach, how to reach out the audiences. And also, I don't know whether the government or the business people really would like us to do that, because there's a lot of educational training need to be done. And we think we're really doing a kind of art missionary work. So mainland China is even more difficult. So I would like to ask the speakers on the floor, can you maybe address a little bit of all these 3 aspects of issues that I have done? And thank you so much. It's my honor to be here.
So I think the question about funding is, to summarize, I think that all of us have touched on it, is that there are different forms of patronage that happen on the government, the public, private, and whatnot. And I think what the 4 institutions represented are showing is that there isn't one set formula. Depending on the context and that you are in, it's a different combinations that we have. So, I mean, I think I can summarize in a short answer like that, unless you want to chime in. I think the first question, if I can make that a little bit more specific about the art market, because that requires probably 3-day symposium to even scratch the surface. So maybe what we can do is for each of us, say something more, a bit more pointed about, because of course the Art Basel and all of us are coming back for the first time in 3 years. Then what are your impressions of how art market is doing, seeing what you are seeing on the floor here and in Hong Kong?
I think during the pandemic, the strongest market was the art market. So all the artists I know were setting records. So I asked one of my investment banker friend that, what's going on? So he said that, during the pandemic, people thought it in a different way, and they're changing portfolios. So that probably his version, but of course, art market is strong, art market is back, and it's not only in the West. Even when I talk to my friends in India, there are a lot of great gallerists, and they all said that during the pandemic, they did very well. And, see, Art Basel, we are here. If you ask me what is my highlight, it's the discovery section. So that is where sort of we first went, and probably we spent about 2 hours there. Because, of course, other galleries, the larger ones, and about their program, about their artists. It's on and off, they have new artists, but when you go to the section like Discovery, it's all new. Most of the cases you discovered this artist. So, yeah, maybe it's related or not related to art market, but I'm just saying there are opportunities. Like, people always want to discover new things.
I'm just happy we're back and Art Basel is in full swing. And I think it kind of shows that you see the presence of all these people here in Art Basel. I mean, that says a lot. There's a reason why people are back and people are happy, and that means it's doing well, I think.
Well, no, I mean, the only thing I would say, I know there's too many questions there, but I think one of the things we're talking about is that we live in this age of great multiplicity of point of view, and we can shift our points of view. We can look locally in relation to globally, across languages, across media. I mean, one of the things about the sort of whole blockchain art thing is that artists are taking it into their own hands to create their own worlds and exchange works without boundaries. And so there's always this innovation, and I do think it's an exciting time of this innovation as the world, we're learning to see there's not one measure. And there's all this multiplicity, and it's very exciting, which, I mean, I think there's more space than for, and as I keep saying, like, you have to keep innovating the frame. There's always art. Everyone's always making art, and there's culture everywhere. And the question is, what are the frames of these organizations that try to connect to people and connect that art to people? So I think there's just more innovation necessary all over.
Okay,
I just want to add to what Rajeeb said. I've not seen the show as yet, but what he said about discovery, and sometimes great art is discovered beyond the market. So that is there. But I want to quickly add that things are moving, things are happening. The pandemic slowed down, which was also a good thing. There was need to pause and reflect and really think a lot about museums and our own patronage and practice. We still are a philanthropic museum. We have no entry fee. But we are building now our museum building, work has started. And the best part of that model that I like is it's not just focused on museum collection or the visual arts. It is going to be a place like run as a cultural center, where we are emphasizing the need to integrate different art forms. So it would have performance, it would have music, it would have musical programs, it should have children discovery programs, science programs, and of course, exhibitions and art-related events. So I think that it's very exciting a world, I feel, in the way that these things are coming up, and hopefully, I see a lot to do, of course, as we go ahead.
Fantastic. I think we have just time for one last question. Nope. Okay, then we can all go back to the fair and look at some art. Good. Thank you so much.
Dorian. Thank you.
Dorian.